We have been looking at a series that we entitled, Come Unto Me, A Call to the Weary and the Burdened. And it is a series that is geared primarily towards a lot of the emotions that we face with life and all of the challenges and the struggles that are oftentimes there. And once we introduced it, we then began to take a look at the first of the many different topics that we're going to consider, and that topic was the issue of fear. And I think that fear is one of those things that I think has affected many of us. I think it grips all of us in a lot of different ways. And the reality is that there are challenges that are ahead, and oftentimes we end up meeting those challenges, unfortunately, with fear. We're going to move from, and what I entitled this whole section was Fighting the Fear Within, and what I don't want to do is leave it on a negative note. It's one thing for us, and we spent quite a bit of time, and I'll review some of this here in a little bit. It's one thing for us to come along and analyze fear and look at it and identify all of the causes, but is there actually hope? Well, the answer is yes, okay? And so throughout this entire study, we're not just going to take and leave it at the, okay, well, yes, you're fearful and you shouldn't be. Yes, you're stressed and you shouldn't be. Yes, you're angry and you shouldn't be. We're going to take and look at how do I handle these issues biblically? And that's a lot of the focus of it. We could go on and on and on with some of the different causes of fear. In fact, the list itself could be endless, and I would say is going to be way beyond the scope of what I want to try to accomplish in this particular study. But we did identify 6 particular causes that I would say are probably fears that most, if not all of us, are going to battle to some degree at some point in our life. And one of the greatest one is the fear of uncertainty. We'll talk a little bit later on as this series progresses. Regret for a person often centers on the past, does it not? Fear centers where? On the future. Okay? Paul says, forgetting those things which are behind, both successes and failures, we press toward the mark. We can't change the past, and let me assure you that your worrying about the future isn't going to alter it in any way, shape, or form. Yet oftentimes fear centers on the future and specifically what it is that is unknown. Most of us like to know what is coming. Most of us like to think we want to know what is coming. I'll be honest with you, there are a lot of things I'm glad God didn't give me a preview on in my life, okay? If He had told me, all right, well, when you wake up on Wednesday, you're going to be faced with such and such and such and such. Now, I might not want to wake up on Wednesday, all right? God doesn't do that, and He certainly, in His wisdom and in His providence, does not do so. But oftentimes, we are centered on the future. The reality is that none of us know truly what the future is going to hold. The second cause of fear that we noticed was the fear that is caused by the formidable. Quite honestly, there are circumstances that seem to be too great for us to be able to be victorious in. And oftentimes, those very topics, those very issues, likewise end up becoming a source of fear for us. Third cause that we identified was the fear that's caused by guilt. Proverbs, I believe it's chapter 28 and verse number 12, is taught that the wicked flee when no man pursueth, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. A guilty conscience is oftentimes a fearful conscience. I'm not sure if you came from east of this direction, but if you did, maybe that's why some of you were late to church. Let me just tell you, there were 7 highway patrolmen sitting up on top of the ramp at exit 106. Well, actually, there were only 5 on the ramp. 4 were on the ramp, 1 was sitting on the bridge with his little gun, and 2 were already down the road pulling someone over. So a total of 7 officers. Now, when you see those blue lights, fear caused by guilt. Okay? The righteous are as bold as a lion. I never cease to amaze how that you can see someone and you'll be driving down the interstate at 65 or 70 in a 65 or 70 mile an hour zone, and there's a policeman's got somebody pulled over. You're supposed to pull over to the left-hand lane and understand all of that. And then someone slows down to 45. Well, what are you doing? The speed limit is still 65. It's okay to go 65. All right? In case you haven't figured it out, if he were going to pull you over, he clocked you a long way before you ever knew it, okay? Fear that is caused by guilt. We saw it with Adam and Eve in particular, and that was where we started it. Immediately, they hid for fear of God. You could go on. We cited a number of other examples as well. Fear that's caused by opposition. This particular study, we looked at being engaged in a great work, and we specifically cited the example of Nehemiah and all of the challenges that he was faced with. A lot of those individuals and some of those circumstances were extremely real. They were life-threatening, and the challenges were there for those who were there doing that work to be faced with such opposition and still maintain a proper element of trust. The fifth cause that we cited was the fear that's caused by others. It could be the fear of retribution, repayment. We saw that with Jacob and Esau. Jacob had deceived his brother, and Esau had sold the pottage and all of that. Jacob got the birthright, and there were years where they were separated. And eventually there came a point in time where the two of them were reunited. Jacob was extremely fearful of what he might do. Joseph's brothers, the same example, Genesis chapter number 50. After their father died, they were fearful that now that dad's dead, Joseph isn't going to in some way repay this, and we are going to end up having the revenge executed on us. We also saw it may not only be the retribution of others, it can also be the reactions of others. And admittedly, and I know many of us are at least tough on the outside, but there's a sense in which probably all of us like to be liked by certain people. And sometimes the responses of others oftentimes cause us to begin to compromise the truth or begin to shy away from something as simple perhaps as handing a tract to somebody. Okay? Oh, we might be fine taking our tough guy approach when it comes to work and our boss, but when it comes to handing a tract to somebody, oftentimes we cower in fear because of what they might do. Then we noted the sixth one, and that's the fear of provision. Probably one that deals with all of us in many ways. The reality of the bills that seem to keep coming in, oftentimes at a rate far quicker than the flow of cash coming into the account. It's amazing how easily and quickly that money can fly out of the account and how slowly it seems to drip into the account. Is God going to take care of you? And the answer is yes. Yet we worry and fret and grow all weary, and we began to look in Matthew chapter number 6 on that particular thing as well. And again, as I stated earlier on, I could go on and on and on and on and on with many, many more causes of fear. But the specific fears may change, but the reality is that the causes of them are actually all very similar. There's an underlying truth that's going to kind of weave its way through all of these things. We defined it this way, and this will give us this underlying truth. It's not any kind of definition that you're going to find anywhere other than right here. It's a state of unrest that occurs when one takes his eyes off God. That's the biggest key element in this. In all of those fears that we cited, the eyes have been removed off God. And they've been placed on circumstances. Then I define the circumstances a little bit further. Sometimes the circumstances are very real. Nehemiah, for example, in the opposition that he was faced with. There were people who were threatening their lives. Were those circumstances real? Yes. Somebody who is battling cancer is battling circumstances that are very real. Okay? It may also be circumstances that are perceived. You drive down the road and wave to somebody who does not return a wave back. Now people sometimes begin to worry. Is this person angry? Is this person upset with me? May very well be they just simply didn't see you. In that case, it is a circumstance that is perceived. Jacob was fearful that Esau would kill him. It wasn't real. We could say that one was feared as being potential. Okay? These are circumstances. Now, if you're the one in the midst of it, it's easy for me to sit back here and say, well, it's a perceived circumstance, okay, or it's one that's feared as potential. If you're in the middle of it, to you, it's very real, okay? Let me back off of that, though, and say objectively that it may not actually be that way, all right? When you take your eyes off of God and put them on anything else, problems are inevitable. Okay? And that list can go far beyond just this realm of fear. But certainly, what occurs when an individual takes his eyes off of God is that he is then put into this state of unrest. The logic says, if this is what occurs when I take my eyes off of God, then the solution, quite simply, is to keep your eyes on God. Okay? Now, we'll examine this a little bit more, and admittedly, it is much easier said than done. The solution for fear, if the cause of it is ultimately taking my eyes off of God, then the solution has to be maintaining a complete confidence in God and constantly keeping my eyes on Him. And we'll cite a number of different passages as we go through this. Let me pull up this one verse as well, just by way of memory. Isaiah chapter 26 and verse number 3, "Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee." There is the parallel of what God is going to do to the individual whose mind is stayed on Him. Logic says if your mind is not stayed on Him, you're not going to experience this perfect peace. Is the problem on God's side, or is the problem on man's side? Well, clearly the problem is on man's side. Now, we wish that that weren't the case, but I can assure you God is going to fulfill His role when it comes to this particular matter. I want you to begin. Let's turn in our Bibles to the book of 2 Timothy chapter number 1. And what I'm going to essentially focus on are a number of central questions that I'm going to kind of ask that are going to help us point to this solution for fear. And we're not going to, by any stretch of the imagination, look at each of these questions today. But I am going to begin to look at one, and it's found here in 2 Timothy chapter number 1. And this is the question that is going to be asked. What do I possess? What do I possess? Because when I come to a greater understanding of what I have in Jesus Christ, it's far easier to trust Him. In fact, a lack of trust is inevitably going to be tied to a lack of understanding of who Jesus Christ is and what I have as a believer in Him. We find in 2 Timothy chapter number 1, Paul is writing, and this is now the second letter to a pastor by the name of Timothy. From what we're able to gather as you go through the books, you find that he seems to be struggling with the very issue that we are talking about, the fear of the future. In 2 Timothy, a little bit later on in chapter 4, it becomes quite clear that Paul is anticipating his death. Okay? I am ready to be offered, he says. The time of my departure is at hand. There are other letters, for example, in the book of Philippians, where Paul anticipated a release. That's not the same here. And as he is writing to Timothy, you remember Timothy was described in Acts chapter 16 as being Paul's own son in the faith. Paul was responsible for leading him to the Lord. And now all of a sudden, Timothy is faced with the crossroads of life without Paul. And it's quite challenging. You may recall various things in your life. Maybe it was with children, your first child. Maybe it was with a job where the reality of it began to sink in and you began to question, am I really ready for this? Okay? I remember when I was trained young, and it's hard to believe, that was all the way back in 2012, and so I'm completing the 4th year, and that's just hard to believe. But I remember early on some of those very first things. I could just about now go down to Greenville and not get lost. I may not know exactly where everything is, but I'm going to be pretty hard-pressed to actually get lost. I remember the very first trip that I had by myself was down there, and it was from one hotel up to the airport in Greer. And boy, oh boy, was I sweating bullets. I look at that now, and it's like, I don't even think about it. All of the training that I had experienced so immediately begins to come into my mind. I'm not sure if I'm ready for this. Okay, it's one thing when so-and-so was sitting behind me saying, watch this, turn here, do this, do that. It's a whole other thing when so-and-so's now out the door. And there's no one back there except the guy wondering, when are we going to be there? And you're, I don't even know where we're going, let alone when we're going to be there, all right? And it's a whole other thing. Imagine Timothy in this situation. Imagine being led to the Lord by Paul. It'd be pretty amazing. Of course, we look at him now and see him, I'm sure, in a different light than what he would have been seen then. But nonetheless, here is Timothy who's faced with a future that is largely unknown. Almost seems as though he had come to depend on Paul and was in many ways struggling with what it was that he was going to do after Paul passed away. So with all of that kind of in the backdrop, notice in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse number 6. Wherefore I put thee in remembrance that thou stir up the gift of God which is in thee by the putting on of my hands. For God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Be not thou therefore ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me as prisoner, but be thou partaker of the afflictions of the gospel according to the power of God. Paul, in essence, tells Timothy, all right, Timothy, it's time for you to come along and stir up the gift that God's given you. The idea is, let's say it this way, fan to the flame of that which you have been given. Put it to use, Timothy. Don't sit there and in some way begin to shrink from fear and cowardice and not do what God has called you to do. Instead, you stir up the gift that God has specifically given you. And then he goes on and he cites in verse 7, and that's going to become our focus. Here's the reason, because God's not given us a spirit of fear. Therefore, you shouldn't be operating in this realm. God has instead given us the spirit, or has given us the elements of power and of love and of a sound mind. And then he says, don't be ashamed of me, of the testimony of our Lord. You know what? You may be called upon to suffer. Don't worry about it. Don't be ashamed of me in any way. Don't be ashamed of me as a prisoner. Don't allow those things to in any way alter who you are in Jesus Christ. You can face unbelievably difficult circumstances and still maintain confidence and still maintain joy. That's the essence of the Christian life. Before I look at verse 7 in a little bit more particular, I want us to identify just a couple of things, and it'll all tie in later on. I'm not sure if I'll have time to be able to tie it in all today. Every person is uniquely created by God. No two of us are exactly alike. I don't know about you, but personally I'm thankful that that is the case. We know that all the fingerprints are different and everything, but the Bible reminds us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Part of that is our temperament, okay? There is the element, by the way, when I talk about this, I'm not speaking of sinful tendencies, okay? That's not at all what I'm saying. But there are people who are far more timid than others. There are some, for example, who will struggle to stand up in front of somebody and talk, okay? Now, you can put them behind the scenes, and in many ways they will thrive in that exact situation. But for them to stand up in front of a group and talk, it's just not going to happen. Okay? They are fearful of it. They're naturally timid by it. And then there are others that seem to be just intimidated by absolutely nothing. You can read of some of the different war generals and so forth. Stonewall Jackson comes to my mind in the Civil War. There he stood like a stone wall on the mountain saying, man, is this guy scared of anything? I don't know. Okay? But these are, to an extent, there are different temperaments. God is the one who has designed us that way. Now, when a person gets saved, we say that he's a new creature. Well, that does not mean that his temperament is completely changed. He is still that same person that God has made and that God has uniquely formed. A shy person is still oftentimes going to be shy when they end up being saved. Now, when we begin to kind of apply this, and there are different types of individuals, but there are some who will have a tendency to look at the future and they will understand the incredible responsibility that comes with it. There is a sense of intimidation by it. There's not this idea of, oh man, yeah, I'm just going to go conquer the world. Instead, they're looking at it like, oh my goodness, I understand the essence of what God's called me to. I understand the incredible nature of the Christian life. I understand the greatness of the task to which I have been called. And then they are oftentimes intimidated by that very task. Timothy, do you remember, was told to let no man despise your youth? I think Timothy had a very good understanding of the incredible task that awaited him. I think he had a very good understanding of the nature of the ministry. I think Timothy had a very good understanding of what God wanted him to fulfill, and I think Timothy was intimidated by that. I think the same is true of many of us today as well. The Christian life is a life that is incredible in its nature. It's a life to which it has an absolutely tremendous calling. Isn't there a sense of intimidation that also comes with it, however? You understand, for example, as a father or as the husband of a home, the incredible responsibility that comes with that. It's not something that is just treated lightly. To whom much is given, the Bible says, much is required. These are truths that we come to an understanding of, that we have this level of appreciation for, but when we see the greatness of it, we can become intimidated by it. Those of you who work with our young people, and let me just say thank you. The work that is done is oftentimes not always the most glorious work, but does it not strike a note of fear in you that what you are teaching them can alter their life? It ought to. If it doesn't, you don't need to be working with them, all right? There needs to be, and to my knowledge, there is a very healthy dose of that. If they follow what you're saying, think about it. I face this idea and this whole aspect of it every single week. The office which I have been called to it's marvelous, but it is, in another sense, extremely intimidating because of what we're dealing with. Okay? And I think Timothy had this kind of a concept regarding it. And oftentimes what will happen is, if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves living in a constant state of defeat because we are overwhelmed by the greatness of the task. And many times we find ourselves here. We'll find ourselves empty-handed. We'll find ourselves saying, Lord, I've got nothing to give. Yet you're expected to give. You'll find the intimidation that can come with whatever task to which God's called you. And here's Timothy, who's right on the verge of losing Paul, and is faced with, I think, a very proper understanding of everything to which he has been called. And here's Paul saying, hey, look, Timothy, you need to stir up the gift that's in you. Here's the reason: because God's not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. So don't be ashamed of me as his prisoner. Don't worry about what the future may hold. You instead be, as the verse 8 ends, you be partaker of the afflictions of the gospel. What if your faith cost you something tomorrow. You see? And we are seeing our society and our world, the landscape of it in many ways change. Yet, what if it costs you tomorrow? Are we still willing to press on? At what point does that cost become too great? Our society today is filled with lots of people who are in essence seemingly along for the ride, and that's about it. I alluded to some of that in the handout this morning in the bulletin. You can read that a little bit later on. But we've got a group of people in America that are just downright ignorant on stuff. I mean, downright ignorant. They don't know who the names of the political candidates are. Okay? Yet our future's in their hands. Isn't that a lovely thought? Okay? They don't have a clue. And you can watch, and I alluded to some of that again this morning. You can read that on your own. But the point is, we've got challenges that are going to lie ahead. Does it change anything? It can't. Let me point out, we'll probably end up concluding with this part here today. Planning the future is not the same as being controlled by the future. Okay? In Luke chapter 14, Jesus asked the question, which of you intending to build a tower sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he hath sufficient to finish it? If you're going to venture into a building project, it's a good idea to be sure that you have the funds and the resources available to finish the building project. Okay? If you're going to build a house, then that's fine. Be sure you've got the money to build the house. If you don't, this is not a good idea. Sadly, there are some who seem to venture off on whims that are really of that level of significance, and they never even sat down and counted the cost. And by the way, let me point out, there is a cost to following Jesus Christ. And that's the essence of what is stated there. It's not a life of ease and luxury and a life of blessing. It's a life of challenges. It's a life of tremendous reward. But it is a life of challenges. And so the point of it is this. There's nothing wrong with us sitting down and planning the future. There's nothing wrong with taking a calendar and trying to anticipate what it is that may or may not be coming. But for us to be controlled by the future is wrong. Okay? You can't in any way control the future, and you can't in any way allow the future to control you. Now, you may make plans. God may alter them. Are you okay if God alters them? Oftentimes, we struggle with the acceptance of it. Now, yes, there is a sense in which, all right, if God says this is what's happening, well, then that's what's going to happen. You can go along with it rejoicing, or you can go along with it kicking and screaming. Obviously, the first is the better option, and there is that sense in which, yeah, we have no choice on it, but we have a choice in how we respond to it. Who's in charge of the future? Thankfully, God. Thankfully, it's not me. Thankfully, it's not you. Thankfully, it's not one of my many calendars in Google. Thankfully, it's God. And yes, we may plan the future, but the issue comes when the future begins to control us. Now, let me just show you where we're going with this, and I'll have to pick this up next week. There's a rebuke that comes to Timothy. Paul tells Timothy, you know what? God's not given us a spirit of fear. So then we could ask this question, why are you living in it? Why? If God's not given you this spirit of fear, then fear is not to be the natural state of the believer. You're not to even be there. Now, an unbeliever doesn't have any other capacity, but a believer does. So then, if God's not given you this spirit of fear, then why are you living there? Let me tell you what, that one is kind of one of those knocks you right square in the teeth, because there isn't a good answer for it. What God has given us, and these are the resources then that we'll look at, He's given us power, love. That's, by the way, a very interesting one. I'll let you ponder. Why is love in this? I can see power, and I can see a sound mind when it comes to the issue of fear. But what does love have to do with fear? Well, you can ponder that this week. Maybe you'll come up with an answer. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord, thank you.